thank you all for sitting through what may be, it's kind of a new experimental presentation. The idea was to try and create an analogy between open educational technology and the diet. What is that? So let's keep it clean. I came up with a bad metaphor, the open EdTech and the Mediterranean diet. This is not going to be a clean presentation. It's not going to be a perfect analogy, so work with me if there's any nutritionalists or doctors out there. I'm not trying to be medically or nutritionally accurate, so keep that in mind. There may be something wrong. But hopefully my stuff on at least the educational technology part in open will resonate with some of what you're thinking and doing. I want to start with this disclaimer. I am not necessarily, when I think about open, and this is what I started with when I talked about our presentation yesterday and talking about workshopping, I'm not particularly interested in open as a license. I'm not particularly interested in open as a contract, and I'm not particularly interested in open as a kind of set of rules. I'm interested as open as a position and as a relationship with not only other people, but with the technology. So I'm not probably the person to talk to about whether or not it's Creative Commons or whether or not you can do this or not. Usually what I say is do what you want, right? That's my idea. I think that the web, the more we try and litigate it, the more we try and control it, the less interesting it becomes for most of us. So there is that disclaimer in the work I've done and will do. I also wanted to start I was inspired yesterday by Daniel and his work to get the OpenMed Torino week out there and show you what's possible. So I wanted to actually start with a demo of ourselves for what it means. Because someone brought up yesterday, and I think it was amongst the group here, how would you do it? How would you get a website? How would you get up and running? And I think that's actually a really important question, and it's one that I've spent most of my career, as Fabio said. I worked for 10 years as both an instructor and an instructional technologist, and my goal, my job, was to try and build and relate pedagogy and teaching to the open web. It's very simple. And I spent most of my career trying to think through what that looks like and what that means, and this presentation will be a reflection of that, hopefully. But it started with a very simple thing. In fact, it started with this idea of web hosting. And so I'm going to start with another bad analogy that people don't like, and I'm kind of moving away from the Mediterranean diet right now, but I will return. The idea of a domain, and when I talk about a domain, what am I talking about? I'm talking about something like gymgroom.com, right? OpenMed.com, whatever you want to call it. That's a domain. That's a URL. It's an address on the web. And that relationship is to web hosting. What is web hosting? Web hosting is the physical server where your data lives. So when you go to openmed.com, the actual data on that address lives on the server. That's it. Well, when we were rolling out this idea at University of Mary Washington, an analogy was important so people understood what it was they were doing. So we tried to relate the idea of a domain or a URL to a street address, and web hosting to the actual house you live in, right? When we think about a street address, it's an abstract concept. When I say I live at 810 Marie Street, Fredericksburg, Virginia, 22401, that's not a physical space. It's a mapping of an abstract space so that you can find the physical space of my house. Well, that's the same thing as a URL. A URL is a rewriting of an IP address of a server to point you to a specific place, a server. And this is what web hosting is. And this is what, for the last now 12 years, we've been building at Mary Washington and beyond for universities, thinking about what it means to manage and control a piece of the web that's yours. I use this cartoonist, kids artist, his name is Richard Scarry, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And he does these great cross-sections of homes, right? And I love it because, like, you got the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, and it's a particular kind of home, I imagine, right? But the idea is, if you relate a home to a domain, or an address to a domain and a home to a web hosting, this would be the space of your domain. And all the different rooms in that domain would be maybe the different applications you install on it, like MediaWiki, which runs Wiki2Learn, which you all saw yesterday, or WordPress, which runs the install that Daniel had you all posting to. So your web hosting then becomes a home at your URL to install all these different applications, which could be thought of as rooms in your house, right? This is the basic concept. And this was the idea at Mary Washington that became domain of one's own. The idea of having a domain and having web hosting as a way to experience and work into the web. We talked about this last night at dinner. The idea that people came up with Bluehost. Idea of getting their own website, starting their own space, and then understanding in some ways how the web works. Well, I'm going to go back a couple of bits because I want to show you this site. So the question came up yesterday, how does it work? What does it look like? Well, let's take a look at that right now. I'm flying on the open web, so this could hopefully get ugly. But let's go here. And this is the actual website we talked about, stateu.org. And there it is. This is a demonstration site. So if you're a student at Mary Washington right now, pretend that this is not StateU. StateU is just for us a generic school. You go there, you click on, and anyone in the audience who wants to do this can. You click on dashboard or whatever, and you'll be greeted with, hey, what's going on? Should come up in a second, and it will basically say, how do you log in? And it will be like a Google login, or a LinkedIn login, or a Facebook. This is just for one way for us to get people in. And once you do, you'll see this. This is actually your URL. So I'm going to put in jimgroom.stateu.org, and I'm going to click continue. And what happens here, think about this, 500, 600, 1,000, etc. students at a campus who can go on through single sign-on, sign up for a domain, and within 10 seconds have a cPanel, or basically a domain, a home on the web, where they can install MediaWiki, WordPress, Drupal, forums. They could do old gold HTML sites and CSS. What you're doing here is you're giving students, faculty, and staff a home on the web, a space where they can actually build the stuff you've been talking about all week, right? When we talk about open, and we'll get to this, probably the single most important ingredient is accessibility and where it lives and who controls it. And I think one of the things we deal with here is that. So this is it. This is cPanel. This is now that home on the web. Let me just show you something. If I click on WordPress here, WordPress is a, how many people have heard of WordPress before? Right? A fair amount of you. WordPress is a site building tool, often associated with blogs in the early days. And what's interesting about WordPress is it's open source, which means you can run it freely and modify it freely. But also it powers 30% of all websites on the web right now. 30% of all websites on the web. That's hundreds of millions of websites, which means it's probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, community of open source development on the web. Which means you build into your community, if you use an application like this, an unbelievable amount of programming diversity from people doing a wide range of things. It's a very powerful application, and one that we spent most of our career building around. So you see me click on the WordPress thing. I'm going to click install the app. It's going to install right there, and then I'm going to just do install. And I'm doing this just to show you, within seconds, if not a minute or two, you can have your own space on the web, and you can install open source applications, which basically enable you to build whatever you want. Websites, open textbooks, forms, image collection sites like we thought with Daniel, you name it. And for me, I wanted to start with the demo because I start to go far afield and talk about all these things, but I want to keep this focused. This is not about this space in particular. This is about a return to the basic fundamental currency and infrastructure that open education works on. And that's the web. We'll talk about that in a second. There it is. I click here on this URL, and what do I have? Like back in the day, 1992, 1993, all going well, I have a website, right? And I have a website, and I think maybe the difference between 1992 and 2017, which is a 25-year period, is how simple it's become for us to build on it. Now that's both a blessing and a curse. And we'll look at why that might be in a second. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight, I don't think clicking a couple of buttons and building a space online is beyond anyone in this room. I don't care what your digital capability or fluency is. It's become that easy. Now, what do you do with it? That's a question. And that's a question you have to answer for yourself. One of the things that started at Mary Washington that I was pretty excited about was students were building their own spaces. For example, this is a student's site. This is her art portfolio. And this art portfolio started in 2013 with a very specific thing. But in 2016, when I returned to it, 4 years later, 3 years later, the actual student had graduated college, had gone on to grad school, had become an artist, and her site became her space where she shares and builds and sells her art. That domain was no longer simply something I did for school. It was a reflection of her as an artist, as a thinker, as a student, and as a professional. It's a space now that transcends just simply the experimental beginnings. And I think this kind of starts to tie into some of the bigger questions we have with the web. As faculty, as staff, as students, where are we on the web? Part of that UMW project was also faculty members who built out their work. They made the work they did available. This is Andy Libby Smith, who's an urban designer and historic preservationist. She has all of her course resources on her personal site for anyone to access at any time. Stephen Farnsworth, he's a political scientist. He specializes in media and the president, so obviously he's having a complete field day right now. He actually is looking at the relationship between social media and presidency, which is a particular moment for that. And that's all chronicled on his personal site. Everyone he interviews, every article he writes, everything he does becomes a reflection of him as thinker on StephenFarnsworth.net. And that idea of the domain then becomes powerful, right? It becomes the locus of identity for you as a thinker. Now, let me go back to my original metaphor. This idea of the Mediterranean diet, right? It's interesting because when I heard about the name and the frame for what you all were doing, I immediately thought about what my wife talks about often. As Fabio says, I was a New Yorker. I grew up in New York. I moved to Virginia to work at the University of Mary Washington for 10 years. Quick funny story. We moved from Brooklyn to Fredericksburg, Virginia. Does anyone know anything about Fredericksburg, Virginia? You do? What do you know about it?
I've been a Fulbright scholar in Mary Washington University
Absolutely.
in Stanton, and I have been to the city.
And you'll
All the neighborhoods.
That's awesome. Right. Cool. So one of the things about it is it's basically Civil War land. It's where the Civil War happened. In fact, Civil War is almost like a current event in Fredericksburg. Like it's constantly happening, right? You always hear about it. So my wife and I moved down there from Brooklyn. We get in, we're moving out the U-Haul. It's December 13th, which we didn't know anything about. And we're walking in, my wife's from Italy, right? All of a sudden, the Union troops start running down the street yelling, "It's a massacre! Run away! Run away!" And the Confederates are chasing them. And my wife looks at me and said, where are we? I want to go back to Brooklyn. That's kind of what Fredericksburg was like in some ways. In other ways, it was quite an interesting town. But it had that legacy of the Civil War, which in many ways still haunts the US. But why would we think about, and so my wife, being from Italy, constantly talks about this notion of the Mediterranean diet. And one of the things that becomes consistent, and I'll ask you this, if you're going to think of a core ingredient, something essential and basic to the Mediterranean diet, what would it be? Any?
Olive oil.
Nice.
And seafood.
This kind of olive oil? Anyone know who this olive oil is? This might be out there. Popeye, right? This is olive oil, Popeye's love. But I loved it because olive oil can be thought of as the infrastructure for the Mediterranean diet. It what connects many of the countries you saw in that previous image, this idea of olives, the Mediterranean culture, the Mediterranean temperature, the climate, and there are vast differences, but there are certain commonalities. One of the things that was interesting is UNESCO linked the Mediterranean diet, and I found that when I was researching it, to one of the intangible cultural heritage kind of great elements of the Mediterranean diet is that it was intangible culture, meaning that it was people working together to create recipes that were handed down over time. So it was actually a social relation that built the notion of the Mediterranean diet, in addition to space, in addition to place, in addition to culture. And so they called it an intangible treasure. I love that. Because one of the ways to think about an approach to open education is this notion of an intangible way in which we approach how we teach and learn. And I think the single biggest change in all of our careers, in all of our lives, has been what? Not olive oil. What has been it? If we're going to say that olive oil is the core element of the Mediterranean diet, what would be the core element of open education in terms of technology? What would be it? Why are we all in this room? You, and you get a car, and you get a car. What is it? It's the internet, right? I mean, that's the single most radical change around the notion of open education we've experienced. And this is interesting because in 1995, Scholastic published a book on the internet, and you see that this kid surfing, right? Could you imagine trying to publish a book about what being like the encyclopedia of everything on the internet? Impossible. But even more than the internet, I think what changed the way in which we thought about open educational technology is the idea of the web, right? Now I want to show you a video from 1997. This is a video by MCI, which was now a defunct telephone corporation. And they talk about the internet in a really particular way. And I want to just show it to you and then talk about it for a second. Hopefully it will play cleanly. All right, hold on. Okay, can't really hear it, so you can see it. So basically, and the sound didn't come through over the loudspeaker probably for our sound issues, this is probably the most utopian ad ever about the internet. There's no race, there's no gender, there's no infirmities, there's just the internet. And that's going to change everything, right? Like we're really walking into this new portal of reality. 25 years later, or maybe 20 years later to be precise, we realize no, the divisions culturally, aesthetically, in terms of poverty, in terms of access, these divides exist still. The internet didn't erase them. In some ways, we can argue it made them worse, or accelerated them. Right? And we're dealing with some of that as a culture right now. But it's a cultural reality. And one of the things that we kind of need to think about, and I'm going to go back to my slide deck, is this. Regardless of, hold on one second. regardless of the question, and I think we need to move beyond the simple question of the internet's utopian, the web is utopian, it's going to save us from ourselves. I think one of the things we need to go back to is to think about the basic principles that Tim Berners-Lee, when he created the World Wide Web, was looking at. And what you all, when you're creating your open educational resources, your open pedagogical approaches, whatever it would be, what are the core elements that are undergirding this technology? In some ways, they're still there, as they were with the first website. This is the first website ever published, right? It was at the CERN, where the web was kind of invented, not too far away. And you'll see, what is it? Simple text and links, right? That's all it was. Hypertext taking you from one page to another, to another, to another, to another. A distributed, decentralized network of resources. That was the core principle of the web, and for me, it remains the unbelievably foundational element of what open education is in relationship to anything technological, because open education is not necessarily technological. But in our moment, we can't get around from the simple relationship that that link leads us to another resource. Early websites were like this, right? Curations of resources for other people, pointing them to things that they hadn't seen before. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is, what do we do with that as faculty? What do we do that as staff? Here's an example. This was a video created by a group of students at University of Mary Washington who were taking a course called the Internet course. And I'm just going to play you a small clip from it. This is produced by students for a course. And I'm actually might just go to the course because we're going to have the sound problem. I'm just going to go to the course website. I want to show you something. Group of students at Mary Washington were talking about the early kind of prototype of the internet, the ARPANET, and how that kind of built out. One of the cool things that they created as part of this is they created a timeline, right? And if I click on this, you'll see that the students did research on the web and built a kind of sophisticated timeline. Let me find that timeline here. A sophisticated timeline using something called Timeline.js. And what is interesting is this is still not that different from that web page from 1990, right? This is text with a series of links. Now we have media, we have audio, we have video, but all of this is easily and openly accessible. It's still the undergirding. And this is a course taught at the university where students curated and built resources for anyone. And part of that relationship was them doing the actual building. And I want to talk a little bit about how we think about what it means to do that. Now, one of the things about the Mediterranean diet is you kind of, it's not, what I like about the Mediterranean diet is it's not necessarily like, you know, caveman diets where you have to return to the Paleolithic times and only eat supposedly what cavemen or cavewomen ate, which is kind of ridiculous. But there's some recommendations. Stay away from saturated fats. Don't eat too many meats. And for me, that's very much related to this notion of staying away from closed web-based systems, like the learning management system, which we call in the US the LMS, or in Britain they often use the term the VLE, or the virtual learning environment. These can be useful, and you might want to eat them sometimes like saturated fats, but by putting them, oftentimes, 99% of the times, all that stuff goes behind a firewall. That's not on the open web. That's not accessible. And another thing that happened is this. We have this notion of the MOOC, which is a very powerful idea. This idea of a massive, open, online course. As you can see, it started in Canada, and people like George Siemens and Stephen Downes, who we'll hear from in a second, framed out this notion that you could build a course with not 5 or 15 or even 100 people, but with thousands. And I think when they were doing it in 2008, 2009, there was 2,000 people in their course, which was unbelievably phenomenal. In 2011, when Sebastian Thrun taught his AI course, was the year of the MOOC, literally, and 190,000 people signed up for his AI course. And that's when we had things like Coursera and Udacity and the explosion of the MOOC. And the MOOC, in some ways, was just a scalable LMS that was arguably open, although we can see how that went, right? They were starting to sell those resources for training. You had to buy the certificate. They were trying to figure out a business model, but the basic idea of the MOOC doesn't really change the fundamental underlying principles of open education. It's available content on the web. The fact that these were highly produced videos by the greatest thinkers possibly, arguably, in the world does make a difference, but it wasn't necessarily as radical as I think everyone thought it was, right? What remains radical is that stuff being out there. Now, one of the ideas to think about is these platforms, whether you're using Coursera or Udacity, or, for example, Blackboard or Canvas or whatever system you might use. One of our arguments when we're thinking about the work we did at Mary Washington in setting up hosting, setting up WordPress accounts, MediaWiki, was that we didn't want the prepackaged takeaway food. We didn't want the kind of saturated fat, fried food that you often get. And this is from a blog, Edinburgh blog, so this is actually Scottish fish and chips, right? What we wanted, and you can think about it, social media in some ways reflects this. Social media, I use at least 5 of these. So I'm not going to pretend that, I'm outside of beauty of the Mediterranean diet. You don't have to be. But one of the things to think about here is how much do we depend upon convenience, how much do we depend upon immediacy, like takeout, and how much do we pay for in the exchange, particularly when we're talking about this for teaching and learning. One of the things that I think undergirds this notion of the diet is fresh ingredients that you control. Maybe you cook in your own garden, right? And for me, you saw examples of these at least yesterday when I was here. WordPress for the OpenMed site for sharing images. MediaWiki is what Wiki2Learn is built on. The Internet Archive. These are all freely accessible applications. One of the nice things is, you know that when you install one of these, people aren't selling your data, they're not stealing your data, they're not taking your data. But also, these are open projects, which means you can contribute to it, your students contribute to it, they can build on top of it, right? When you think of open educational resources, what's the single greatest open educational resource on the web? I mean, this is the easiest question to answer. Without question, it's Wikipedia. But we rarely mention it. We rarely talk about the undeniable value of this. This is from a course in 2008 taught by John Beasley Murray and Brian Lamb, who was his instructional technologist. And they did something really remarkable. They took a course which was designed around Latin American literature and South American literature. 20 novels. And they had the students write or edit those 20 Wikipedia articles and bring them up not only to good standing, but to extraordinary standing, which is 1% of all Wikipedia articles. These students started over 15 weeks editing and building these articles, sometimes from scratch, sometimes existing. Of the 20 articles, 15 were considered not only good, but extraordinary. Think about that, over the course of 15. On average, these articles would get 200,000 hits a month. Also, think about what infrastructure they're using. Are they running servers? Are they building anything other than simply editing an existing open resource? So this faculty member, I think, really started to upset or challenge this notion of open as a pre-existing resource that you create, but is actually part of a community. Because part of editing Wikipedia is understanding how the community works, understanding how the politics of it work, understanding that it's not same from country to country, language to language. And so it opens up the vast cultural expanse, that is the web. Whereas building a single resource and then putting it out there that gets neglected, who's building it? What good is it educationally if a faculty member and instructional designers are building a resource for students to consume? How is that any different than what we've had before? What are we learning from that? I'm not sure it's anything. And I think returning to this notion of culture and the Mediterranean diet, not as purely a nutritional idea, but as a cultural fact of how certain cultures imagine their community around food, around recipes, around building these open resources becomes really powerful. Because the idea of when you cook at home, when you eat at home, when you grow your own food, is it's a social relationship, right? To quote Charlton Heston from Soil and Green, at the bottom of it, it's people. For me, the biggest problem with the open educational resource movement is it's replaced the notion and the power of people teaching and sharing with objects that need to be commodified and exchanged. And you can still commodify free. So how we as a community relate to each other is far more important than that final product of, I would play this because Downs has a really good last minute and a half, but the audio isn't good. But he basically says as much. He talks about open not so much as a series of license, so much as a series of restrictions, what you can use, what you can't use, but as a basic premise for how we learn and share and build a sense of community and culture and understanding. And that's not going to be consistent. One of the things I like about open source applications installed and built by faculty at their particular space is it resists the monoculture of one tool. One tool like Twitter, one tool like Facebook, one tool like Google. The web was designed to be decentralized. And part of a movement, if we want to think about that, is how do we as faculty and communities and universities re-decentralize the web so that it isn't controlled and maintained and designed by a few, but by many. Someone who's done some really interesting work in this regard, her name is Maha Bali. She's at the University of Cairo, the American University of Cairo, in Egypt. And she did a presentation recently at OER 17, a keynote. And what I found really fascinating about her presentation and her keynote was that her keynote had been done on her blog for months before the actual presentation. She had written about it, she had shared, she had interviewed people, and her blog, her web space, was an ongoing professional relation of her thinking. And I think here we are. We're educators. We're in a university. Our job is to help faculty or help students think about what they want to do critically. We have the tools to manage and to show that over time, 4 years. Why wouldn't we use something like a blog, as much as people associate it with bad politics and cats? Why wouldn't we use a blog to reflect on our thinking over time as students? I've been blogging now for, it will be 12 years in December. And that has been an ongoing discussion of how I think about, it hasn't been good, it hasn't all been pretty, sometimes it's better than others. But why, as faculty members and as students, are we asking people to do this otherwise? I don't understand it. One of the tools you saw the other day, actually yesterday with Daniel, is this notion of the SPLOT, the smallest possible online learning tool. And no one really used it, but did you recognize with that tool when you published your image, it didn't have to be associated to you? You didn't have to take credit for it. You can make it anonymous. You can have anyone do it. One of the things we also have to think about when we ask students to build, if we ask students to build resources online, is to think about, are they out there, and to what degree are they out there, and what degree are they comfortable with being out there? And that's a conversation as faculty and students you have to have. What I like about these smallest possible online learning tools, or learning online tools, or whatever they call it, and this is a concept that was designed or kind of imagined by Alan Levine and Brian Lamb at Thompson Rivers University in Canada. The idea being here is, do we want to always dictate how students are seen online? You've seen them, I don't have to go too over. You saw the image collector, there's also a writer, there's also an audio tool, there could be a video tool, and this is something that's starting to emerge. Kind of the idea of these small recipes for sites that people can build and create and share online. It's a very different idea. One of the cool examples, and this was done by Martha Burtis and Andy Libby-Smith at Mary Washington, whose site I showed you earlier, they had a very particular need for a small tool. This is just a form in WordPress. Students go around and they survey Fredericksburg. They put in the name of the house, the address, and the details because they're doing urban development. And now one of the biggest databases about Fredericksburg housing is designed and built and populated by students. It's an open tool. Martha Burtis also created one for students making GIFs and learning how to make GIFs. One of the kind of examples that I like to, and I don't want to go too deep into this because it could be a whole separate thing, is at Mary Washington we created a course called DS 106, Digital Storytelling 106. And the idea of the course, at its simplest, is there was really no curriculum. The curriculum was to have students get their own web space, build their own site, and then participate by creating assignments. They took assignments from around the web on video production, audio production, image design, image editing, you name it. And the actual course was designed and fueled by the students. And the idea was for them to build an online presence through these various assignments. They had to do X amount of assignments every week. And the notion was recenter the notion of that course, at least, around students producing something, rather than appealing to a predefined notion of the book. But the examples go on. This is an example from biology. Steve Gallick, who's a histologist, study of cells, he actually went in and had his students not only take images of what they saw underneath the microbiome, under a microscope, but also narrate. So there's 900 different cell images that are narrated about what's going on. He called it cell storytelling. One of my favorite examples, Sue Fernsebner is a historian at University of Mary Washington. She studies Chinese history. And this is an example that I think brings many of the points I'm saying home. So I'll take a second on it. She's studying a major historical event called the Taiping Civil War. Has anyone ever heard of it? Interesting, right? It's a major historical event in China. Millions of people died. It was a civil war in the 19th century. Her students built a site. And I was trying to show you a timeline before, but I'll have a good example here. They used a WordPress site. There was a woman who recently wrote a book on this historical event. They went and they interviewed her and recorded it. So there's one educational resource that the students built. The next one is they built a timeline, which takes you with a free tool called Timeline.js, which I mentioned before. But look how amazing this is. They did all the research around the historical events leading up to and after this particular event, and they built the timeline communally in Google Docs, in Google Apps. Actually, they used Google Spreadsheets. But this is actually a course-created resource, an open educational resource. Finally, as a course, they built a map. And they mapped the Civil War in China. Now, if you were to search Taiping Civil War on Google, the third hit underneath Wikipedia and some ad is this student site. That is an open educational resource. And that is also a learning process for students. It's part of the learning and teaching. They're engaged. We talked about active learning amongst our group yesterday. This is a brilliant example. It's an ongoing resource on the web. And for me, open education as just an object means nothing. Open education as a pedagogical journey to think and interrogate what's happening in the classroom and how we learn, and maybe interrogating the resources you find on the web. Now that's interesting. That gets us to a new space, I think. Similar thing happening at the University of Oklahoma. This is a Omeka exhibit. Omeka is an actual exhibit builder. And this is actually focusing on Oklahoma during the Depression, which was hard hit by the Depression, and so it's an archive of all of what happened during that era. Built by students, maintained by students. Georgetown doing a similar thing. They're using Omega, WordPress, and several other tools like Timeline.js to come to grasp really with their slave history. They have a history of slaveholding, and so they built a site using these tools to define them. Now, I would show, this is another video from Michigan State University. Michigan State University is using domains in an interesting way. They're asking all their grad students and all their faculty to get a domain. And if they do anything, create a digital object, a publication, you name it, it should be up there. They're thinking of domains as the actual representation of their academic and scholarly life. And if you wanted more details, Chris Long, who's the Dean of the Arts and Sciences School at MSU, is pushing hard on this. Mainly because, like many of us, he got a Bluehost account in 2004 and it changed his career. Coventry, we mentioned them before. This was a tweet just today. And this is an interesting and I think contentious point right now, and it's one I'm interested in very much. The idea of a domain is a place of framing and building your identity. The idea that this is a place online that you would use to fashion who you are. I think for students, that's a process of exploration, so you want to have a space where some of that maybe isn't always public. There's got to be space for that. But I do think about thinking who we are and what these spaces are important. Mark Sample is running this at Davidson College in North Carolina. And he has a couple of really salient points. And I just want to think about it. I could do a presentation on this separately, but I just want to allude to it. This notion of having a space online to think about this notion of web literacies. To think about, given how contentious information is, what is, fake news? Where do we get our information? Do we know how to reverse Google search? Can we find this? Do we know where this image came from? Is this image really referencing what people say it is? Right? There's a recent example of the tech. Have you heard this example? It's a US-specific example, but it's interesting. The Texas secession movement, so where supposedly Texans want to leave the US, that kind of group on Facebook was being run by a group of Russians who had no relationship to the secession. And so this notion of propaganda, of how the web and social media is being used to maybe undermine some of our relationships to nature and fact and truth, it's really important right now. Developing and forging a digital identity through online publishing, I'm really interested in this idea of reclaiming ownership of our data. How much of our data is on other people's servers? Whether it be Google, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, your mileage may vary. But if your data is there, to what degree are they capitalizing on it? And to what degree might we renegotiate that relationship? There's a movement in Finland right now, or at least the white paper started there, focused around this idea of my data. And that's the name of the movement, my data. And the idea there is, why don't, if Google's going to sell our information, we get a piece of it? Why don't we have control over what they sell? Why don't we approve or disapprove of what they have? So right now, at least in the US, that's a completely unilateral relationship. We sign an agreement, they take everything they want. What if we get into a relationship that is actually somewhat more power balanced? I think the EU is trying to move through this with how they think about storage and data right now. And it will be contentious and difficult, but I think it's important. Finally, I just want to stop, and I'm done. So there's that. But I want to finish with just saying that, for me, open, rather than it being, I think one of the dangers of open right now is it's become something whereby it's attractive because there's funding, and there's a relationship in many ways at universities to getting funding, having a certain position, maybe even power. But I think at the bottom line, when open education is at its best, it's faculty and students building resources and decentering any one focused resource like the textbook. To me, it's just simply bonkers that we're still talking about the power of textbooks in 2017, 25 years after the birth of the web. I'm not sure why we even still talk about textbooks. Seems to me a complete anachronism. With that, thank you all very much.